We're going to look now at some background material for Acts chapter 10 and the story of Cornelius. And the first question I'd like to tackle is this. Why was it such a big deal that Peter was called by God to visit the house of a Gentile named Cornelius? Well, if you were a Jew back in the first century like Peter in the early church, the Old Testament law was not only the foundation of your religious beliefs, but it was also the foundation of your entire political society. And kosher Jews had no relations whatsoever with Gentiles. Gentiles, of course, meaning non-Jewish people. And they wouldn't be caught dead in a Jewish home, a Gentile home, for example, especially not to share a meal together. Matter of fact, some of the rabbis taught that if an unclean Gentile touched food and you ate it, that demons would be communicated to that food and you could ingest demons and become demon-possessed. That's how far it went. Of course, God wanted separation between the Jews and Gentiles in their morality in the Old Testament, but many of the rabbis, especially in Jesus' day, had taken it to a great extreme that was very detrimental, of course, to the church and its desire that Jesus had for its unity. And for Peter to obey God's command and to go to a Gentile's home like Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 was really to risk ostracism, to risk excommunication from the synagogue, and to risk losing everything that was positive about being part of Jewish society. What about the vision Peter got in which a sheet came down from heaven and God told Peter to eat what was considered unclean meat for kosher Jews? Let's talk about some background to that whole situation. Well, in the Old Testament, God did set out some meats which were considered to be unclean for the Jewish people. They were not allowed to eat. For example, some of the unclean animals were the camel, the pig, the eagle, the owl, the cat, the dog, the snake, the lizard. Probably most of us wouldn't be all that interested in eating most of those meats. But some of these prohibitions were laid down because some of these animals I just mentioned were scavengers and maybe could easily carry disease. But I think the primary reason for these prohibitions was to separate God's people from the idolatrous worship and the immoral worship that went along with these feasts that they could be engaged in when they would be eating these meats. And so it was for the protection of God's people in their morality. A kosher Jew like Peter would have never been caught dead eating any of these animals, and that's why it was such a shock to him when God himself appears in this vision while he's in this trance and tells him to eat these meats that would have been considered unclean. What was Christ's strategy in gradually weaning his followers off of the Old Testament law after the church was founded in the book of Acts? For most of us, including the Hebrew people, change is something that we like to engage in real slow. And I think Jesus was very wise as he began to abrogate the Old Testament law to replace it with the new covenant and the institution of the church. And Jesus did this engage in this process gradually. First thing Jesus did was he had women join his group, which was very novel. The rabbis, many of them, didn't even allow the women to be a part of the teaching services in the synagogue and didn't feel that they should be a part of that. Well, Jesus included the women, and they served in intricate roles in his ministry, and that was one of the first steps that he took towards the oneness in the body of Christ that we're shooting for in the New Testament. Another thing Jesus did was he spent a lot of time with those who were considered outcasts in Jewish society. For example, he spent time with the tax collectors. He spent time with the harlots and those who had been excommunicated from the synagogue. Then later in Jesus' ministry, we see him in Samaria, and the Samaritans were half-breeds of Jews and Gentiles together. And then towards the end of his ministry, we see him even going across the Sea of Galilee to touch into Gentile territory and sow some of the seeds that would later bear fruit during the ministry of Paul. And then throughout the book of Acts, we see, after his resurrection, that continual progress toward oneness. And Peter, in Acts chapter 10, is a crucial step in that direction. Remember how Jesus said in Acts 1 that the gospel would go to Jerusalem, to Judea, which was the northern section of Israel, to Samaria, where these half-breed Jews and Gentiles lived, and then to the uttermost parts of the earth. Well, Peter's vision in Acts chapter 10 was the first step in including Gentiles in the new organization called the church. And the dream for Jew and Gentile, for slave and free, for male and female, all serving each other in one body called the church, that dream that Jesus prayed for in John 17, that they would be united in heart and purpose to share Christ's message of love and forgiveness to the world. It was well on its way by this time in Acts chapter 10, but it met with significant resistance because of the cultural prejudices that those people had to overcome. After Peter passes off the scene, how does God continue the progress of abrogating the Old Testament law through the ministry of Paul? Well, Paul was called the apostle of the Gentiles, just as Peter was sent primarily to the Jewish people. And Peter's story dominates the first 12 chapters of the book of Acts. But by the time we get to Acts 13, the narrative takes over with Paul's life, and he takes center stage as he takes the gospel to the Gentiles. His mission from Christ was to take the good news to the uttermost parts of the earth. And throughout the book of Acts, we see him on his first missionary journey, then extending out a little further on his second missionary journey, and ultimately out even a little further on his third missionary journey. And his biggest challenge during all of those journeys was to help Jews and Gentiles to get together and set their prejudices aside and not look down upon each other, but to appreciate both cultures and enjoy that oneness that comes through Jesus Christ.